I told them. They don't listen. They never listen, Kalak Draxon growled, pushing aside the thermal cloak as the transport ramp hissed open. Heat slammed against his skin like punishment. Varno Prime's atmosphere had grown heavier since his last landing here. Or maybe he had just grown old in a different kind of gravity. The landing platform shimmered under a harsh blue sky, jagged towers piercing upward like rusted blades. Rows of armored personnel stood in formation, polished, obedient, unaware. He gave them no acknowledgement. These were children playing at command, unbloodied, faces scrubbed clean of history. He stepped forward. His boots struck the steel ramp with a sharp clank that echoed down the hangar's hollow spine. Dust hung in the air, coarse, coppery, dry. The stench of industrial solvents stung his nostrils, masked beneath synthetic perfumes that couldn't quite conceal the corrosion underneath. Behind him, the shuttle groaned and rose, vanishing into the heat glare. Kalak didn't turn to watch. He didn't need to. A thin figure approached from the far end of the dock, mechanical joints clicking faintly beneath ceremonial armor. Kalak Draxon, the figure said, extending a hand. Your return honors the Syndicate. Kalak's eyes lingered on the extended fingers, then met the speaker's gaze with all the warmth of stone. Spare me the ceremony, Tavik. Tavik retracted the gesture without protest. They await you at Council Hall. They've prepared They want a ghost's opinion, Kalak interrupted, brushing past. Let's not pretend otherwise. The walk to the council tier felt longer than it should have. Not by distance. By weight. Screens embedded in the walls projected reels of triumph. Varno cruisers vaporizing opposition fleets. Declarations of unbroken dominance. Kalak's own face appeared in one, mid-roar in a battle 17 years past. They hadn't asked permission to use the image. Of course they hadn't. He reached into his coat and drew out the rust-colored insignia pinned inside. The metal was cracked down the middle, the fracture forming a jagged split through his former division's crest. He hadn't worn it since the Battle of Zintar's Reach. The chamber doors opened as if sensing his presence. Inside, a semicircle of syndicate leaders sat in tiered suspension chairs, suspended above the dais like vultures roosting. General Draxon, announced the Grand Chair, whose voice carried none of the warmth of leadership. You've seen what's coming. The Rythex push into Voral space is more than posturing. We need counsel before. They're not posturing. They're preparing an execution, Kalak replied, stepping onto the central platform. But you're not ready. None of you are. Murmurs rippled across the tiers. Chair Corain, a narrow-faced strategist with data nodes embedded across his scalp, leaned forward. You've just returned. What makes you? I watched them erase 4 systems in 9 days. I've seen what they do to defensive arrays that take a decade to construct. And I've seen what happens when they encounter unpredictability. A pause. Waited. Waiting. He couldn't digest Earth, he said, voice firm, not raised. It choked them. Laughter broke from one of the rear seats, dry and derisive. You still believe humans are exceptional. I know they are, Kalak replied without hesitation. Another counselor leaned in, his optics flickering. You once led a purge against a Terran battalion, did you not? Zintar's Reach? Kalak nodded once. I did. The image rushed back, dust storms thick with iron shrapnel, bodies torn from both sides. The humans had fought like wounded predators. Improvised shields from wreckage, tripwires made of energy cables, thermal lures masked as escape pods. He'd thought it over when the smoke cleared, thought it again when their hacked guidance drone redirected a Varno cruiser into its own battalion. There was no elegance in how humans fought, only raw, adaptive brutality. I watched them cripple a warship using fuel canisters and misdirection, he said. They didn't just resist, they changed the rules. They made the battlefield theirs. Earth is fractured, primitive, another leader argued. Their weapon systems are a generation behind ours. That's what makes them dangerous, Kalak snapped. They aren't bound by doctrine. They bend war into shapes they can survive. War is numbers, technology, trajectory, Karan said coolly. Kalak stepped closer. It's desperation, timing, refusal. He reached into his satchel and placed a single object on the platform. A fragment of a human-made explosive, charred but intact. They wired this inside a diplomatic container, timed to trigger only if an ambassador fell. The trigger, heart rhythm. Silence, but not the kind you asked me to avoid. This was the breath before impact kind, where tension has mass. They aren't stronger than us, Kalak said, voice lower now. But they fight, like they know they have. Nothing else. A counselor exhaled through his gills. You've changed. I learned, Kaleg replied, turning his back to them. And that's more than I can say for you. He left the chamber without waiting for dismissal. Outside, the wind clawed across the stone courtyard. The air was too dry for comfort, heavy with the scent of old circuitry and stale smoke from nearby refineries. A young officer stood by the stairs, watching Kalak's approach. Barely more than a boy, his armor unscarred. What are you looking at? Kalak asked, voice rough. I heard stories, the boy said. That you never lost a single squad. Kalak stopped. They didn't come back because of me. They came back because Earth didn't kill them. He walked past, letting the echo of those words do what the Council never would. From the observation deck beyond, he stared into the orbital layer. He knew what would come. The Rythex didn't fear what they couldn't understand. And they didn't understand. Humans. A relay flare blinked far in the upper stratosphere. Coded light from a long-range Terran drone. It was old tech, outdated by decades. But it was still up there. They never let anything go to waste. Kalak's eyes narrowed. He raised his comm to his lips. Begin compiling all recovered Terran countermeasures, he ordered. We don't have time for arrogance. He turned and began descending the observation ramp. The wind carried dust over the edge of the marble parapets, spiraling into the low valley where heat shimmered like a mirage. But Kalak saw nothing unclear. Move forward, no delays. This ground doesn't stay ours unless we take their last breath with it. Kalak Draxon barked the order as he leapt from the descending dropship, the hull still steaming from orbital friction. The air clawed at his skin with its sharp, dry sting, thick with ionized ash and scorched plastics. Zintar's atmosphere wasn't meant to sustain anything for long. Not airframes, not bodies, not time. It ate everything eventually. Gravel crunched beneath armored boots as his strike formation spread across the cratered ridge. Jagged outcroppings jutted out like exposed ribs. Visibility dropped with each gust of the pale red wind, as shards of glassed soil danced across their visor fields. Draxon's heads-up display mapped the debris field ahead. The terrain was layered with downed alien vessels, both Varno and Terran, shredded, indistinct. His squad's path cut through a canyon formed by a ruptured fuel barge and the fractured skeleton of a mining hauler. Unit Groll, take the west ledge and set up a resonance shroud. We'll flush them out with grid sweep, he commanded, flicking the encrypted node embedded beneath his wrist. Acknowledged, but sir, don't offer advice unless you've bled for it, Kalak snapped. Through the broken hulls and craters, the strike team advanced like a serrated blade, wedging between the shattered spines of what used to be orbit-capable machinery. No movement yet, only static buzzed in the commnet. Not a scream, not a ping, then a click. That single sound triggered a shiver across every proximity sensor. It wasn't mechanical, it was improvised. Intended to be heard. Drop! Kalak barked, crouching just as the ridge to their left detonated in a wall of thermal foam and concussive shock. The shroud vaporized. 3 of his lead units vanished beneath a crushing heap of detritus, the canyon shifting like a wounded beast. Kalak's optics surged, scan lines flickering. The blast hadn't come from above, nor from a Varno signature. It had originated inside a gutted Terran lander. Bury the charge beneath their own wreckage, muttered Arverth, his second in command. That's not tactical doctrine, that's spiteful invention. They're baiting us, Kalak said. Pull thermal visuals, locate heat shadows. They're here. Movement registered beneath the cargo deck of a nearby derelict. Not a formation, an erratic scatter, no pattern. Which made it more dangerous. Why bait us just to scatter? Arveth asked, narrowing his visor. To herd, Kalak replied grimly. Another explosion, this one behind their formation. Seismic, not destructive. A series of underground compression pops. Not enough to kill, just enough to panic the untrained. They're not trying to hold ground, Kalak said. They're trying to disrupt thought. Unit Kren fell mid-step, impaled by a metal pipe laced with conductive wiring. It was spring-loaded, triggered from a ground plate disguised with alien paneling. He gurgled once, convulsed, then went limp. Medical, someone called. No, Kalak said. Push forward. They want us to waste time. The canyon narrowed. A headless Terran transport blocked the far exit. Too clean to have fallen randomly. Kalak signaled for a lateral sweep, fingers flashing through coded hand gestures. Units split left and right. A burst of audio static hit his comms. Open channel, he said. A voice crackled through, unaccented, unnervingly calm. You're thinking too loud, Commander. Kalak froze. The voice came from inside their comm network. We rerouted your node's outbound relay, the voice continued. Useful, once we learned what color your firewalls bled. This is Draxon, he barked. Identify. No need, the voice said. I'm already leaving. The signal cut. He turned. The Terran transport was gone. Just gone. Not vaporized. Not burned. Removed. In its place stood a compact distortion field made of scavenged emitter rods, half of them Varnic grade. That wasn't sabotage, Arveth said, awestruck. That was theater. A single body was left behind. Human, young, strapped into a position of mock surrender, knees folded beneath him, one arm raised. The other, missing. Kalak approached. The man's eyes were open. Dead. No. Breathing, barely. Dying. Why fake surrender? Kalak muttered, crouching. The human blinked, once. Blood slid from the corner of his mouth as he whispered, closer. Instinct flared, too late. The Terran's chest detonated in a radial EMP burst, frying 3 suits in a 10-meter radius. Power nodes collapsed. HUDs blinked into black. Kalak's system surged, but held. The pulse had been coded, wrapped in radiation shielding, until proximity override. The device was embedded in his ribcage. Kalak stood slowly, his optics locked onto the human's belt. Carved into the alloy buckle was a symbol. Not military, not rank. A wolf, teeth bared, etched into the faceplate. Crude. Raw. Intentional. Commander, Arveth rasped, still recovering. What kind of soldier turns his own body into a detonation trigger? Not a soldier, Kalak said. A species with no leash left. They regrouped. In the far distance, automated sensor buoys began failing in sync, triggered by chained overloads. Daisy-chained through unshielded cabling, likely rerouted via the same Terran tech they'd written off as junk. Retreat, Arveth asked. Contain, Kalak replied. They don't want ground, they want us guessing. Draxon keyed into the warpath relay, uploading the encounter data under a locked tag. Unassimilate. Tactical behavior, human derivation. He stared once more at the wolf sigil, now clutched in his fist. This wasn't the last time he'd see that emblem. You didn't bring back a report, Draxon. You brought a warning. But warnings without results are noise. The chamber stank of sterilized hubris. Cold light spilled from recessed ceiling grids, casting sharp lines across the obsidian-paneled council floor. The air wasn't stale. It was filtered, to the point of lifelessness. Like every word spoken here had passed through too many mouths, too many layers of denial. Kalak stood at the central platform, a curved slab of etched stone surrounded by tiered observation banks. Varno and Syntychus, dozens of them, watched from their elevated positions, robes folded like shields, masks obscuring expression but not skepticism. He didn't glance up. Instead, he activated the feed embedded in his left gauntlet and projected the data forward, not through a laser plasma display, not through theatrics, directly to their neural interfaces. Numbers, timelines, causal chains, human maneuvers. The warpath of the Zintar engagement glowed beneath their seats. Sabotage using pulse-welded Terran insulation cables, fleet disorientation triggered by light-frequency manipulation at orbital dusk. We traced their improvisations to scavenged material and urban legend. Not doctrine, not military design, Kalak said flatly. This is not a species bound by structure. A low chime buzzed across the seating tiers, denoting disapproval. From the uppermost throne, Vyron, council head, leaned forward. His voice was soft, but sharpened by decades of unchallenged command. Kali used tricks. Tricks do not win wars, tricks delay defeat. Kalak's response was immediate. They do not seek fairness. They seek outcome. That's exactly what makes them fragile, Vyron countered. Chaos breeds collapse. It's only a matter of pressure. We've had 4 centuries of pressure, Kalak shot back, and yet, they're still adapting, still fighting. Another counselor, Tervan, scribe of logistics, interjected, blinking through his optical relays. We analyzed Earth's last 20 engagements. Statistical modeling places their probability of system-wide loss at 84% within a direct confrontation. And what happens when they refuse your model? Kalak asked. What happens when you burn everything down, and they plant weapons in the ashes? No answer came. Instead, the room grew colder. Not in temperature, but in posture. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, not silent, but withholding. You're infected, Vyron murmured, almost to himself. Kalak narrowed his eyes. Explain. You speak of them with reverence, as if they've earned your loyalty. I watched a half-dead soldier reroute our guidance systems using only a disassembled ration pack in his own power cells. Kalak said, That is not loyalty, that is respect. Then your respect blinds you, Vyron said. You forget who we are. Kalak stepped forward, his shadow falling over the central flame conduit that burned faint green from biofuel vents. I remember exactly who we are. We create policies. They create consequences. Counselor Jern tapped his data glyph. Commander, we appreciate your perspective, but our analysts have accounted for emotional factors in the models. Their determination isn't enough to overcome entropy. You keep using that word, entropy, as if it owes you obedience. Vyron gestured, and a file lock triggered with a sonic click. The entire council floor retracted half a meter, signaling the end of formal presentation. Will be all. Kalak didn't move. You're dismissing this? After everything I've shown? You've shown us tactics, not outcomes. Belly turned a retreat into an ambush using nothing but debris. They coded sabotage into medical scans. They forged neural disruptions using field broadcast towers meant for entertainment. Enough, Vyron snapped, rising. This chamber is for strategy, not admiration of the enemy. Kalak's voice dropped. You're not strategists. You're archivists of extinction. Gasps echoed around the tiers. 2 armored enforcers stepped forward from the shadowed corridor behind him. Neither spoke. So this is the response, Kalak said, lips curling. Not denial, containment. You've become unpredictable, Draxon, Vyron replied, hands folding calmly over his data plate. And we don't need more unpredictability right now. They've already changed the war, Counselor, you just don't realize it yet. The enforcers moved closer. Kalak didn't resist. But he did glance, once, briefly, at the youngest of the seated analysts, an unranked observer whose face twitched when their eyes met. Not fear, recognition. A seed planted. They led him from the chamber, boots echoing off the polished floors, footsteps measured not by force but consequence. Outside, the corridor was cooler. A faint pulse of light ran along the veins of the stone walls, too even to be natural. Surveillance relays tracked each movement. He could feel the data itch across the nape of his neck. "Where to now?" he asked one of the guards, voice low. "No return to the Citadel." "And the data?" "Archived, redacted." He nodded slowly. "Of course it is." But his left gauntlet flashed once in his peripheral vision. Data bleed, backup subroutine, encrypted replication still active. The logs weren't lost, just buried. He smiled. Inside his quarters. What they called a retention suite. Khalek sat alone, fingers pressed together, eyes on the stone-grain floor. "They want you erased," came a voice from the chamber wall. He didn't look up. "I expected worse." The wall shimmered, revealing the young analyst, unannounced, unauthorized. "They'll monitor everything after this. I rerouted the entry record. 10 minutes, maybe less." We help me." The analyst hesitated. "Because I saw the same thing you did. They're not just surviving, they're growing in the middle of war. That changes the rules." Khalek studied him. "Name?" "Surin," he answered quickly. Khalek nodded. "Get out. Now, before you get named a traitor." Surin vanished back into the corridor, and the chamber walls resumed their static gray. Khalek stood slowly, flexing his fingers. "DBI buried it," he muttered. "But it's not forgotten." He turned toward the heads-up display above his bunk. Data crawled across the feed, unauthorized, unregistered. A ghost signature. Terran cockered. He tapped the feed once. It opened. "Execute Layer 4, no retreat, no pattern." Hrothgar's voice transmitted without emotion, reverberating across the synthetic bridge of the command monolith, Rythex Obel. His 6 eyes remained fixed on the gravitational distortion field ahead. Velas Planetary Defense of Tarvek 3. A minor colony once known for its geothermal archives. Now, it existed only as a mark on a Rythex convergence vector. The field pulsed once. Then it shattered. Within seconds, entropy began to unfold. The Rythex Legion didn't deploy in formations. They descended as algorithms. Each warcraft carried a swarm-brain interface, modules that bent time fragments into localized chaos fields. They didn't drop bombs. They didn't fire weapons. They erased coherence. On Tarvok 3, buildings collapsed inward as their structural logic dissolved. Gravity warped at random. Atmospheric readings returned null values. Communication relays died before they could record their own shutdown. Time itself fractured. First slowly, then all at once. Like a cracked lens sinking into black. Within the Varnak outpost near the sector border, a heads-up display surged with data corruption warnings. No visuals, no audio, just recursive decay climbing across every surveillance feed. Counselor Wren, positioned at the monitoring relay, leaned closer. "We've lost 3 satellites. The 4th's feed loops the same 6 seconds. Permanently." Khalek Draxon stood behind him, arms folded. "Not jamming, that's collapse." "Ellie didn't even enter atmosphere," Wren muttered. "How do you fight this?" "Ellie don't want resistance, they want disintegration." A-pulse. From the Rythex command ship distorted orbital matter. Moonshed fragments, elongated and spiraled into strings of colorless debris. The attack didn't aim for kill counts. It targeted continuity. Without a structure to return to, no survivors could organize. No trauma could form memory. On board the Rythex Obel, Hrothgar moved through the ship like a shadow guided by logic. His limbs retracted and extended depending on need, forming new connections between control clusters. He passed through a chamber lined with incubation nodes, each housing species dissected from previous campaigns. Their remains floated, suspended in vacuum-stabilized spheres. One of his aides, smaller and multi-spined, approached with a Tactiscan update. "Losses minimal. Terrestrial defense layers never activated." "They never understood what we were," Hrothgar replied, scanning the drifting wreckage. They anchored their survival to linearity. We simply removed the ground beneath their assumptions. Human forces have not yet responded, the aide added. Believe we're predictable, Hrothgar said. As if we strategize like organisms, that's their flaw. Emotion clouds their protocols. He approached a dormant projection grid and activated it. Not a laser plasma display, but an osmotic particle relay array. Earth's orbital defense maps flickered in minimalist geometry. Prepare compression strike simulations for Sol Sector, Hrothgar ordered. Initiate variable entropy drip. Nothing immediate. Let them question time. Back on the Varno orbital line, Kalak sifted through the last intact black box transmission from Tarvik 3. Only one segment played, a weather drone's final data stream. It recorded a building that ceased to exist halfway through a thermal scan. No fire, no impact. The structure had simply lost certainty. Their technology operates outside fixed-state behavior, he said aloud. They fracture outcomes. Brent stared at the footage. They can't possibly maintain cohesion across this scale. They don't maintain, Kalak said. They consume and replicate. He paced the chamber, thinking aloud. We designed our tactics for resistance. Lines, reinforcements, buffers. They designed theirs for termination of pattern. The screen shimmered again. A faint signature emerged from beyond Tarvak's outer rim, unidentified. Not Rythex. Kalak froze. Feed that to secondary display. The unidentified blip began shifting frequencies erratically, mimicking Rythex entropy patterns, then falling back into standard Terran protocol. It was a ghost signature, human-coded, buried under mimicked chaos. They're testing Rythex recognition systems, Kalak muttered. Ren glanced over. What if the humans have seen this before? We haven't, Kalak said, but they're already building language for it. On the Rythex Obel, Hrothgar's second aide entered the command chamber. The anomaly on the far edge of the system. Human probe. Not offensive, likely reconnaissance. Let it persist, Hrothgar said, dispassionate. Let them witness. Nothing educates like collapse. In the depths of the ship, Rythex drones, obsidian in shape, covered in etchings that defied geometry, began aligning for Sol campaign pre-configuration. Their minds weren't personalities, they were branches of intent. Each drone carried with it a payload not of warheads, but of structural denial. They would not conquer, they would unmake. Back in Varno space, Kalak leaned closer to the transmission. The Terran signal began reconfiguring itself, encoding stuttered signals into old languages, obsolete relay formats. They're layering their message, he said, voice tight. Hiding intent within pattern failures. They're speaking through entropy. Rand exhaled. No one does that. Humans do. They're learning the shape of this enemy. A chime pulsed from the security panel. A new file had arrived, unauthorized, not from the Terran feed. Kalak opened it. It was a single still-frame image taken milliseconds before Tarvak's disappearance. In the foreground, a Rythex drone, suspended mid-air. In the background, a human sigil burned into rubble. A crude outline of a spiral wrapped around a jagged line. He'd lack a message in entropy, Kalak whispered. The drone was facing it. If that signal doesn't match any of their known frequencies, and the modulation, why would they overlay static onto their own beacon? The Rythex scout vessel Nexarray 7 hovered in low orbit above Earth's southern hemisphere. Inside its observation hull, Analyst Unit Virnkal extended his tendrils across the sensory arch, parsing a chaos of electromagnetic noise below. Human networks were flaring in unpredictable bursts, shortwave emissions, satellite pings, ground relays folding into redundant loops, some bouncing signals off retired space debris. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't even coherent. Commander Darren, overseeing the scan, narrowed his pupil cluster. Intentional disarray. Obfuscation disguised as incompetence. or incompetence mimicking subversion. They're broadcasting children's songs across military channels, Varno said, visibly unsettled. The relay activated. A simple melody stuttered through, a recording of a Terran voice singing a lullaby in fractured English, accompanied by intermittent static. A moment later, the ground beneath the transmission source detonated. The city block collapsed in stages. First the perimeter buildings, then the interior courtyard where the signal tower had been hidden beneath a civilian apartment complex. Thermal spikes revealed underground mine grids triggered by pressure sequence rather than proximity. Darren leaned closer to the data rail. There was no countdown, no detonation signature. They buried it inside routine. No known faction of theirs takes credit, Varno added. The satellite identified as origin point decommissioned 31 years ago. Then it was never decommissioned, Darren muttered. It was reprogrammed and left to rot until the right moment. Another feed lit up. North of the impact site, one of Earth's older orbital units, designated DS-3, began its descent. Its trajectory was uneven, thrusters engaging intermittently. It veered, stuttered, and corrected mid-fall. The scout team cross-referenced every database. The craft had no listed affiliation, no crew. Its frame bore no defense systems. It wasn't a weapon. Yet Earth's orbital defense platform opened a corridor in the atmosphere for it to pass. Are they guiding that wreck? Varno asked. It's not a wreck, Darren replied. It's a trigger. The DS-3 capsule collided with the side of a Rythex observation relay stationed on Earth's exosphere. Before impact, the capsule released a concentrated EMP field. Not standard, not directional. It blanketed the relay's outer shell and injected fragmentation code into its subsystem. The relay went blind for 11 seconds. When it came back online, 4 adjacent sensor nodes had re-registered as human-ready. Impossible, Varno said. No, Darren corrected, engineered. They're rewriting identity architecture mid-interference. Back inside the Rythex Oval, Varno reviewed the data without expression. He stared at the visual of the satellite core splitting apart mid-plunge, revealing a hollowed-out array of compressed fiber explosives and an antenna spike broadcasting a corrupted children show audio loop layered with navigation echoes. They bait their own population, he said. His aide hesitated before replying. It appears they use outdated infrastructure to mask trap systems. There's no clear division between civilian and military operation. That's not improvisation, Varno said. That's culture. From Earth's northern hemisphere, an old weather satellite began broadcasting a weather report in a dead language. No storm was incoming. The report looped with altered timestamps that, when decoded, translated coordinates across multiple war theaters. Rythex locations, not human ones. Varno watched, impassive. They're communicating through contradiction. Is it a signal to their forces? The aide asked. No. It's a warning, but not to us. On the surface, deep in a Terran bunker shielded beneath a hydroelectric dam, a single technician adjusted the signal spectrum. His hands moved without hurry. On the console beside him, a child's toy sat, scorched, half melted, eyes missing. He didn't speak. He keyed in another transmission. This one a string of vowels laid over a jamming wave used to block commercial satellites. Not encrypted, not obvious, the kind of code that didn't need to be secret because no one would believe it mattered. Above him, the Rythex began reclassifying a network node as unstable. In reality, it was being redirected into a mobile ambush. Darren updated the fleet feed. They are mapping us by reaction. They prod to see if we bleed. Varno activated a feed to the outer colonization grid and issued a new directive. Reduce reaction time. Ignore anomalies that do not meet 3-layer threat criteria. But what if they escalate beneath threshold? Let them, Varno replied. Their strength comes from chaos. We will offer nothing to reflect it. Elsewhere in orbit, another probe tumbled out of geosynchronous drift. This one had been written off as space debris decades ago, until it released a flare that was not heat-based but structured light. The pattern matched a human sublanguage known as Morse, rearranged to mimic rhythmic music. It signaled once and disappeared. In its place, 5 atmospheric disruptors in Rythex Grid 19 malfunctioned simultaneously, caught in recursive feedback loops from their own target acquisition logs. The system believed they had been moved and self-erased. Darren stared at the readout. We didn't shoot. They didn't shoot. They rewrote our trigger logic. Virnkal, reviewing deeper telemetry, offered a grim suggestion. What if the signal wasn't for us? Then who was it for? The question remained unanswered. In the Terran vault, the technician exhaled slowly and shut down his board. The corridor lights flickered once, brief power disruption. But he showed no reaction. A moment later, a figure stepped into view behind him. Halbert Draxon. They've seen your work, Halbert said. The technician looked up. Let them. Sector 9 just folded. Trigger the cavern collapse or we're dead. The voice crackled through the command relay in short, clipped bursts. No inflection, just directive urgency. Beneath the fractured skyline of Halbert City, every structure still standing cast jagged shadows across rubble-paved streets. Glass spires had long since shattered. Communications towers now leaned at odd angles, their purpose lost but their location weaponized. Commander Ren Varric crouched beneath a buckled transit bridge, sweat cutting through a layer of urban soot on his brow. His mask hung at his neck, useless now. The filters had clogged 2 hours prior. Dust clung to his lips. It tasted like carbonized stone and decay. He keyed in a frequency swap and whispered, "Detonation grid KL. Now." Miles below, in the substructure of Halbert's underlevel, a series of kinetic lure mines pulsed silently in a spiraling chain. They had been seeded weeks earlier, placed beneath the city's foundations, hidden beneath maintenance tunnels and service access ways nobody remembered to document. When activated, they didn't explode. They pulled. The moment Rythex siege walkers advanced into the perimeter, the field activated. Gravitational anchors caught the attackers in mid-step and reversed mass alignment for 6 seconds. The air bent. Ground became sky. Sky became vacuum. Then, everything caved. The entire south block folded inward like a sinkhole swallowing steel bones. Rythex infantry units didn't scream. They didn't break formation, but they disappeared all the same, consumed by the terrain they had never planned to engage. Vern watched the dust geyser from afar and spoke calmly. That's one throat cut. Above, Terran drop capsules hurtled through the upper atmosphere. No formation, no flare, just velocity and angle. Their chutes weren't visible until the final 200 meters, deploying with high-velocity foam that hissed on contact with air, slowing the descent but spraying blinding residue into nearby Rythex sensors. Specialist Cole Bren hit ground first, shoulder dislocating on impact. He bit down, popped it back into place, and drew his reinforced cutter. No hesitation. The unit's objective was simple. Rear incursion, then scatter. They weren't meant to win. They were meant to break pattern. Behind him, 3 Terran units moved through the wreckage of a drone terminal, dragging plasma splitters scavenged from a Rythex walker's disabled chassis. The weapons weren't fully understood. That didn't matter. They didn't need to work perfectly. They needed to cause hesitation. Inside the lower sanctum of the old municipal archive tower, long since gutted, Command Tech Hal Draven monitored over 24 overlapping feeds on a rusted-out display wall. Not laser plasma, not state-of-the-art, just a rewired, industrial monitoring board, retrofitted to mirror encrypted signal updates. He toggled to ground view feed 6. A Rythex command unit turned into a street it assumed cleared. It wasn't. Layered beneath that corridor were heat trace lures broadcasting thermal signatures that mimicked fleeing humans. The command unit fired. The explosion ignited 5 directional charges embedded in the sewer grates below. The entire lane buckled, forcing the unit upward. Exposed, inverted, and surrounded. Terran scouts emerged from above and below. The first strike hit the core node. The second wasn't needed. Draven turned to his comms officer. "Tell them we're back in rhythm. Patch Unit 12 into the overhead fold. They'll clear passage with counter-rotation on Tunnel 3. Meanwhile, Ren moved through what had once been a luxury tower. Its frame moaned with every step. A few walls still bore remnants of art, charcoal smears of what might have once been cityscapes or faces. He paused briefly, just enough to register them. "Commander," came Cole's voice over the short-range relay. "We've breached their rear structure. They're holding but recalibrating slow." Ren nodded even though no one saw it. "Feed them more chaos. Take left flank. Route the power cells into the drainage line." "Sir, that'll blow out our exfiltration tunnel. We're not exiting through there anyway." Cole didn't question again. The line clicked out. Elsewhere, in a scorched chamber beneath the old hydrogrid, 2 Terran engineers worked side by side on jury-rigged sensor distorters. One was adjusting wiring inside a damaged Rythex limb actuator, converting its movement logic into a terrain remapper. The other fed raw power through a relay spliced from a solar microbank designed for agricultural lights. "EB Lie won't anticipate terrain repurpose," said the older one, soldering fast. "Their thinking's vertical, not adaptive." Mayoka paused. "You sure this will trigger feedback?" "No. That's why it'll work." The makeshift rig pulsed. On the Rythex tactical stream, half the city appeared to shift 3 kilometers east. Their drones paused, re-evaluated, and split formation. Inside the Rythex Obel, Vrothkar studied the disruption logs. Every predictive vector had failed in under 90 seconds. "Pull back air swarm units," he said flatly. An aide responded, "They're entangled in fallback loops. Orders will reach them delayed by correction cascades." "No correction. Delete them." Back in Halbert, Ren stepped over a downed Terran body, face hidden behind a cracked visor, comm unit discarded beside him. It still buzzed faintly. He picked it up, wiped dust from the front, and held it to his ear. A voice played, a recorded command loop from the dead soldier. "If you're hearing this, the charge held. If I didn't make it, the breach point's live. Use it." Ren looked up. A transport tunnel, collapsed halfway, was glowing faintly at the end, pulsing red. He keyed in. "Unit 8, I've got a gift." The tunnel roared as the charge went off, ripping a Rythex flank wide open. "Jaborski." "They aren't fighting for land. They're fighting to be remembered." Dalok Draxon spoke the words without moving his eyes from the display. He stood inside a temporary Varno relay bunker, surrounded by tactical analysts who barely acknowledged his presence 2 cycles ago. Now, not a single one spoke over him. A transmission replayed on the primary heads-up unit, grainy, staggered, unfiltered. Earth's megacity zones were fractured but pulsing with raw movement. It wasn't coordinated in the way Varno war models expected. It was something more chaotic, more committed. The footage showed a school beneath the central subway levels being cleared by non-military personnel. Rows of small figures were ushered into pressure-sealed capsules, each containing cryofiltration pods designed to suspend biological function for long-term refuge. Some of the children clutched drawings. One waved goodbye to the man closing the chamber door. His own father, who limped back up the stairwell and vanished into smoke. Kala clenched the edge of the console. They don't separate war from survival. It's the same act. To his left, an aide whispered, "They've installed hibernation networks in their sewer systems. Why would they?" "They're planning for the possibility that Earth becomes uninhabitable," Kalok interrupted. "And yet they stay. Because someone has to turn off the last switch." He keyed in the field audio. A soldier on the recording shouted coordinates into a static-laced mic, voice shredded by pain. The helmet cam showed his legs crushed beneath a collapsed overpass. His blood had soaked into the dust, forming dark rivulets that snaked toward a ruined data console. He dragged himself with one arm toward the control board. "What is he doing?" asked one of the strategists. "He's rerouting the targeting systems manually," Kalak muttered. because his squad was the only one with a clean relay path. He knew that before he moved. The footage ended when the control node surged with heat and the camera dropped sideways. Kalak stared at the frozen frame. They don't ask if it's survivable. They ask if it's worth doing anyway. Vern stood in the rear of the room, arms crossed, jaw locked. We underestimated their tolerance for loss. You misunderstood their reason for fighting, Kalak corrected. Another data stream flashed. A recovered fragment from an intercepted Rythex drone. Not encrypted. Just damaged. The telemetry contained a strange object wedged into the frame. A drawing. Scorched at the edges. Crumpled. But intact enough to make out a rough sketch of a blue and green circle. Stick figure people standing together around it. Words in broken earth language across the top. We come back when sky is fixed. The LAI left it inside the drone before it exploded, one analyst said. Not to send a message, Kalak replied. To be found. Another feed activated. Direct from Earth's surface, Terran guerrilla forces detonated charges beneath a Rythex forward crawler, forcing it to rotate on its own stabilizers. As the machine's orientation corrected, a data burst from the surrounding rooftops flooded its optical relays with feedback imagery. 100 distinct faces. Civilians, children, the dead. The crawler locked, confused by emotional recognition. It stalled. Long enough for one unit to attach a fusion breacher to its vent chamber. It crumbled sidewise. Kalak said nothing. In the following minutes, other counselors entered the room. No formal invitation, no declarations, just presence. For the first time, no one interrupted him. No one doubted the data. He turned slowly to face the assembly. You watched Earth burn. You expected surrender. Counselor Duren, formerly one of Kalak's most vocal skeptics, stepped forward. We're seeing behavior that defies conventional war theory. You thought they'd retreat when overwhelmed, Kalak continued. They made evacuation bunkers beneath cemeteries. They embedded fallback systems inside power grids meant for farming. Their children memorized defensive drills before they learn arithmetic. Viren's tone had lost its edge. We underestimated the degree to which they'd weaponize memory. Kalak walked to the wall and placed his hand on the access port, transmitting the final entry from the cryo chamber footage. A small boy, before stepping into his pod, reached up to the camera and whispered something. The system's audio filter translated it. Make sure they see us later. The room remained utterly still, but not lifeless. It carried weight. The kind no gravity could simulate. Kalak looked up. You're no longer strategizing, you're reacting. That's what they wanted. Viren approached the table. Then guide us, not because we agree, because you're the only one who's ever listened to them. Kalak nodded once. Then I need direct access to all orbital surveillance. Every scrap. Every bypassed frequency. Earth's not using one battlefront. It's using a pattern of memory to fight. They've turned culture into camouflage. The room acknowledged him not with applause or slogans, but with operational compliance. That was how Varno surrendered authority. Back inside the private archive, Kalak reviewed a separate file. One never shared. His helmet cam from Zintar's reach. It showed a human soldier barely alive, dragging his wounded comrade through fire and wreckage. The younger one kept repeating the same thing, barely audible. We told them we'd come home. Kalak leaned back and closed his eyes. Not warriors. Anchors. Execute the loop. Burn the key after the fold. That single command was all Earth's orbital array required to override Rythex core synchronization. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't heroic. It came from a technician buried beneath kilometers of concrete, using a stolen interface hardwired into an outdated guidance system, repurposed from an old weather drone. The code traveled upstream, bouncing through relay clusters disguised as orbital debris. No alarms, no glow. Just input and collapse. Above Earth, the Rythex command grid flickered. What began as a timing error multiplied. One vessel misread a location ping. Another translated its own shield perimeter as hostile interference. Within 22 seconds, 6 Dread platforms activated fail-safe protocols against phantom threats, targets they fabricated for themselves. Rythex fleet coordination fractured mid-formation. Daron, on board the retreating Rythex vessel Corin Gate, watched the display as hundreds of units broke rank, firing sporadically into designated blind sectors. Their command route issued hard reboots, but it was too late. Earth's injection had corrupted the sync frames at their core. There would be no clean reset. He stood motionless, watching strategy disintegrate without external pressure. They didn't outgun us, he muttered. They rewrote the rules before we noticed. On Earth, in the shadows of half-toppled towers, Renvark received the orbital collapse update from Ground Command. "They're eating their own tail," said Draven over the feed. "Pull your teams back. Let the confusion finish it." Ren turned toward the shattered street behind him. His men, filthy, bleeding, half-starved, had already begun dragging each other toward the fallback tunnel without needing orders. They knew when not to waste a bullet. On the Rythex front line, several drone spires fell uncontested, collapsing inward like hollow reeds. Others shut down mid-air, systems looped in false logic sent from misclassified civilian signals embedded in music transmissions. What had begun as data warfare evolved into ideological rejection. The Rythex couldn't adapt, because they couldn't believe adaptation was necessary. By the 3rd hour, the fleet above Earth had gone dark. They didn't broadcast defeat. They didn't send demands. They simply disappeared, folding into emergency retreat paths and leaving no trace but the wreckage floating behind them. Uncommanded, unclaimed, unfinished. From the Varno Council Tower, Kalak Draxon stood before the core assembly. No armor, no command tag. Just the weight of everything he had watched and every word no one had believed. Until now. "We expected fire," said Counselor Duran, watching a heads-up feed that displayed Earth's orbital ring still transmitting low-level data pulses. "They didn't burn us. They waited. They planned for this before we even entered orbit." Kalak spoke, not to argue but to conclude. "They didn't retaliate. They removed permission." Bjorn nodded slowly, subdued. "The Syndicate has voted. We will issue a ceasefire to Earth." "You'll need more than a document," Kalak replied. "You'll need humility." The chamber held the tension like a sealed vault, but there was no resistance now, only the echo of collective acknowledgement. Uncomfortable. Overdue. Outside the hall, Surin stood near the observation alcove, watching the Earth feed cascade across the monitors. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The humans had done everything they set out to without requiring approval from anyone. Later that day, a transmission from Earth pulsed through neutral comms, a narrow-beam message timed to coincide with the Galactic Summit signal relay. It wasn't encoded. It wasn't encrypted. It was Kalak's voice, broadcast on a frequency that ensured every member of the interstellar community heard it within minutes. "You feared what they might become. I feared what we might miss. You tried to contain them. They built out of containment. You called them primitive. They built complexity out of fragments. You studied their weapons. You never studied their memory." He paused. Then came the final words. "Humanity doesn't escalate, it ends." The screen held for 5 seconds on the Terran orbital ring. Half-built, asymmetrical, covered in patched metal and antenna clusters that glowed with atmospheric dust. Then it cut to black. Later, in the debris fields where Rythex ships once held orbit, one object drifted without signal. A Terran probe. Scorched, scarred, still functioning. It played a single audio loop every 11 seconds. Barely audible, wrapped in noise. Not a threat, not a command, just 3 words. "We remember everything." Kalak, watching from the Varno Relay Center, closed the feed. He leaned back in the observation chair, hands clasped. "It's over," Duran said behind him. "No," Kalak replied. "It won't be. Not for them. And now, Not for us either. The war ended without surrender, because Earth never asked for one.